Hello and welcome to the screencast. This is Hendershott-Kraetzer in the Department of Humanities at Olivet College, and today we're going to be talking about cultural studies. The reason we're doing this is it's an important field of study for literature, film, telecommunications, media studies, a lot of fields really. It's a very powerful way of thinking about the text that you encounter. So it's useful to have an introduction to where it comes from, where it is today, and some kind of basic methodology of the thing to give you an idea of what it is that I'm going to be asking you to do at various points throughout the semester. So let's get started and see what's going on with cultural studies. Okay, we'll begin with a little wee history first of all. It's a post-World War II movement, mostly, with its origins in continental European thinkers, but it really has its antecedents in countries in continental Europe. And it actually begins back in the 19th century with Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Engels. In the post-World War II era, Roland Barthes, Pierre Bourdieu, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Lacan were very influential, as well as Mikhail Bakhtin and Ferdinand de Saussure. There are a lot of others. Those are just kind of the major names that might be familiar to people who've done any studying with literary theory. In Britain, it became popular and important in the 1960s, and two names that are really highly associated with it there are Stuart Hall and Raymond Williams. In the U.S., it caught on in the mid-1980s, early on with the University of Minnesota and then with the University of Wisconsin, and it quickly spread all throughout the country. Today, it's a huge, sprawly field, and it's not so much a critical theory or a literary theory as a critical practice that is informed by theories from a variety of disciplines. So you can't really call it a literary theory because it borrows from so many different fields, but it is a methodology informed by theory. That's probably the best way of thinking about it. What are some of those disciplines? We've got Marxism, feminism, media studies, film studies, postmodernism, anthropology, social studies, semiotics, technology, the sciences, the hard sciences like chemistry, biology in particular, postcolonialism, gender theory, rhetoric, race and ethnicity studies, economics, and body theory. And again, that's just a sampling of all the different disciplines that feed into cultural studies and that use it in one way or another. If you're gonna do cultural studies, I guess one of the first things you gotta do is talk about what culture is. The shared meanings we make and encounter in our everyday lives. The practices and processes of making meanings with and from the texts we encounter in our everyday lives. Okay, so what the heck does that mean? Let's take it part by part. You can make meaning individually by your individually conditioned encounters with any particular text, but culture depends upon shared meanings. It's the understandings you have of something that you share with other people. So you might have an individual, unique meaning, but that is a tiny, tiny part of culture. Culture itself is the meanings that we all share. This can be symbolisms, it can be the understandings or definitions of a particular word or a particular concept like liberty, even on the level of like a movie. What we tend to think of when we think of a movie is going to be different from what another cultural group would think of when they think of movie. And that includes not only the thing you go to see, but the entire experience of going to it, where you go to it, who's there, and that sort of thing. They're the shared meanings that we make. These meanings aren't handed down to us by some authority on high. We are actively involved in making these meanings together. That's one way in which meaning is developed, is by our dynamic interactions with the world around us and the things that we encounter. Whoops, sorry about that. Got a telephone call coming in here. So I'm just going to shut up for a second and let it do its thing, and then we'll come right back. So that was my wife, Lisa, calling in to leave herself a message. That was very exciting. So we not only make meanings together, but we encounter shared meanings. So it could be a meaning that we blunder into. So it could be a meaning that other people, that other groups have made collaboratively, whether they know it or not, that we run into and then that we have to integrate and work with, and then we share in the making of that meaning as well. These meanings that we make and encounter aren't special or unique, or it's not like meaning time. We're going to get together and all make meaning. It happens in our everyday lives, just part of living life. We encounter this stuff, and that's one of the important things about cultural studies and the way it thinks about culture, is that it's everywhere. It's all around us. We're a part of it. We're imbricated. We're planted deep inside culture, just navigating, kind of like a fish swimming through the water. Or a bird that's flying through the air. It's just what we do. Culture is practices and processes. It's the things we do, the way we go about doing those things. And it is how we engage with the things that we encounter as we're going through the world. And not only how we engage with them, but that we, again, pull from them. So we encounter them, we pull from them, we give to them. It's a dynamic kind of reciprocal process. Texts is one of those kind of vexing words that people run into. Like, why do you call it a text? Why don't you just call it a book? Why don't you just call it a movie? If you call it a book, or if you call it literature, basically you're saying, okay, this is something that's available to people who can read and who can write, which is, in fact, not most of the planet, either now or historically. Text comes from a Latin word which means to weave. So a text is anything that can be studied, anything that can that meaning can be derived from. So a text can be a book, it can be a movie, it can be something that is actually textile, it can be a woven cloth, it can be clothing, it can be hair. It's anything that can be read, that's a metaphor, that we, again, encounter in our everyday lives. Second definition of culture: an ensemble of beliefs and practices that function as a pervasive technology of control, a set of limits within which social behavior must be contained, a repertoire of models to which individuals must conform. An ensemble is a group. It's not a single belief or practice. It is a group of beliefs or practices. Culture isn't just one thing. Culture is many things all working together. And they are beliefs and practices, the things we think and things we do, all of them working together again. That function as a pervasive technology of control, a set of limits. A pervasive technology of control. Technology not in the sense of, like your iPhone or the computer that you're watching this on. They work as a pervasive technology of control, which means they're everywhere. Sometimes even that you do not know it. And they kind of hem in and manage our ways of thinking, frequently without us being aware that culture is doing it, which kind of gives you this sense of culture is sort of menacing. It's kind of lurking over the top of you, determining the way that you live your life and think your thoughts. Outside of those limits is where you can't go, not because it's necessarily forbidden, although in some cases that might be true. You can't do certain things, but you might not even be able to think of yourself as operating outside of those limits. These limits contain social behavior, not that it's simply contained, but it must be contained. So again, this is an idea that there are behaviors that are sanctioned, and there are behaviors which are not sanctioned. And the unsanctioned ones have to be contained in some way or another. They have to be restricted. Otherwise, basically, the wheels come off the cart in culture, and culture can't function anymore. Culture is a repertoire of models. So again, it's a group of things and models, which basically means, okay, here you've got this way in which you can act. Here are ways in which you can't act. Good models and bad models. An example from Romeo and Juliet. Romeo, when he finds out that he's banished, that he can't be with Juliet anymore, shows up at the friar's cell and starts weeping and wailing and crying. And he is chastised by the friar and the nurse both for what they describe as womanish behavior. This is an example of Romeo negatively modeling behavior. Men don't act like this. When Juliet comes and cries, it's okay, because that's how girls act. They cry. But according to that model, men do not. And those models are those which individuals, again, must conform. You don't have a choice, because culture is so powerful in its imperatives that they cannot be resisted. It's an ensemble of beliefs and practices, a set of limits, and a repertoire of models. Ways of thinking, ways of acting, limits, so boundaries inside which you can operate and outside which you should not go, and models. Here's what you should do, here's what you should emulate, here is what you should not emulate. What I'd like you to do now is pause the video and jot some down, write down some notes, and you can click back if you want to go through these two definitions again. And write down maybe a paragraph explaining how Greenblatt's definition is different from Story's. You have two different ways of thinking about culture. There isn't one right way of thinking about it. There are different ways of thinking about it. I'm going to be quiet for a second, and then I'm going to move on to the next slide. You feel free to pause right now if you want to take some time to jot your notes down. Okay, so we've looked at culture, so now we need to look at what is cultural studies. Jonathan Culler, in his book Literary Theory, very short introduction, describes it this way. A critical field that seeks to demystify and understand the functioning of a culture, particularly in the modern world, how cultural productions work, and how cultural identities are constructed and organized for individuals and groups. Okay. I think the two key words here are demystify and understand. What this means essentially is, Culler's operating from the assumption that culture is mysterious. Its operations are opaque or tenebrous, cloaked in shadow. So the job of a cultural studies critic is to unpack these complex systems and understand how they work, particularly how they go about constructing and organizing identities, both for individuals, so how you come to think of yourself as an individual, and how you come to think of yourself as a part of the various groups that you are a part of. The general goals of cultural studies bring heightened attention to the beliefs and practices implicitly enforced by particular literary acts of praising and blaming. So here we have that word, that phrase, beliefs and practices, again, implicitly. These beliefs and practices are being enforced without drawing particular attention to the fact they are. And the means by which it happens is praising and blaming, and we're going to get into that in a couple of minutes. Also, understand the multiple ways in which identities are formed, experienced, and transmitted, which again is coming from Culler. So the idea of identity, how it's made, how you experience yourself as yourself, and how that sense of identity of you or your group is transmitted or communicated to other people. Identities, again, can include individual and group identities. Groups can be defined by race, gender, sexuality, age, ethnicity, religion, education, economics, region, nation, political affiliation, and so on. There's hundreds of ways in which you can define a group. And they can also be defined by your sense of your belonging or exclusion, your sense of identification with any of the above. So that's a way in which your identity would be formed. So how do texts work in culture? By implicitly enforcing beliefs and practices. We talked about that a second ago. Enforcing means they're saying, this is what you must do. Cultural texts do this work implicitly. They basically are doing it, they're just not calling attention to the fact that they're conditioning how you should believe and how you should act. How do they do this? They articulate cultural codes of behavior. So how should you act? By active and passive process of acculturation. Actively is directly modeling, do this, do this, do this. Passively is showing it in ways that are attractive or showing a particular behavior in ways that are negative or frightening, but never commenting on it. So it happens both ways. The much more powerful effect is when it's done passively, because people can resist something that they're actively told to do, but if it's passive, it's just sort of there, and it's just sort of right, it's just sort of the way it happens, and if it happens a lot, then you just sort of come to accept it, and before you know it, you're doing something, didn't even know you're doing it. Texts not only reflect culture, but help to shape, articulate, and reproduce codes, beliefs, and practices. So they reflect what happens, but they also condition it. So they say, this is the way people act, but by showing the way people act, they're also helping to perpetuate that way of acting or that way of thinking. So here we're looking at Juliet, taken from the web. Variety of images from all sorts of different websites. What I'd like you to do is pause the video right here, look at these different visuals, and then when you're ready, go ahead and hit play again. And we're going to move on to our next slide where you're going to get another series of visuals of Juliet. Study that one, and then once you're ready, hit play again, and that's going to take you to some questions that I'm going to have you attempt to answer. Okay. Now that you've looked at those things, and you can always go back and look at them again, I'm going to have you do some application kinds of questions. So again, you're going to be doing some writing for me on these things. First question is kind of a three-part question. What beliefs about beauty are implicitly enforced by these images? These images aren't saying this is what beauty is, but they are implicitly suggesting ideas about beauty. What beliefs about femininity are implicitly enforced by these images, and what beliefs about Juliet herself are implicitly enforced by these images. What codes of behavior are being articulated? Now that's hard because they're not actually doing anything, these visuals, but there are ways of behaving that are being articulated by these different individuals and by the individuals as a group. How might these images reflect cultural codes of behavior? There's a quote mark missing right there. And how might they help to shape, articulate, and reproduce those codes, beliefs, and practices? And there's a question mark missing there. There's no right or wrong answer to these. It's just I want you to work with these ideas for a little bit. Again, I'm going to shut up for a second so you can pause here, and then we're going to move on. So now that we've done that, I'm going to move on and give you another set of questions that you can ask about text and culture, and then we'll do some applications with that. Okay, how does text work in culture 2? One way that you can address this is to ask how those texts enforce, articulate, reflect, and shape beliefs, practices, and codes. So you praise and blame. So you show something as positive, as praiseworthy, or something as negative or blameworthy. And you do this either explicitly or implicitly through censure or through celebration or through presenting something in a negative context or a positive context. Through containment and exclusion. So you can wall an idea or an act off and present it as odd or outside the norm. So, okay, it's there, but it's weird but harmless. Or exclusion, you can actually chuck it out. This is unacceptable behavior. Exclusion can happen for ideas, can happen for people, obviously. Reinforcement. You can't do it just once. If you do it just once, it's a one-off. If it happens multiple times in multiple contexts, then it's a much more powerful way of shaping. These processes of praising and blaming, containing, excluding, or reinforcing are often passive, indirect, or implied, rather than asserted outright. Again, they're much more powerful if it's a passive process than an active, explicit one. Okay, here we have a still from the film Avatar from 20th Century Fox. I am assuming that most of you are familiar with Avatar. That's kind of a risky assumption. I know not everybody has seen every movie of all time, so this one was pretty popular. Most people are aware of it. So, if you are familiar with the movie Avatar, here are some questions for you to ask yourself. How does it use praise to endorse, articulate, reflect, or shape beliefs? And remember, this praise may be implicit, passive, indirect, or implied. How does Avatar use blame to endorse, articulate, reflect, or shape practices? So how does it use praise to promote beliefs? How does it use blame to promote practices? How does Avatar use exclusion to endorse, articulate, reflect, or shape beliefs? So who is excluded? Why? How are they excluded? What form does the exclusion take? Is that individual ever allowed back in? Under what circumstances? Take a few minutes to answer these questions to the best of your ability. If you have never seen Avatar, that's okay. Just swap in a movie or TV show with which you are familiar. Do a little brief explanation, a little summary like I did for you of what's going on with your movie or your show just to familiarize me with it. And then go ahead and just drop in the name of your thing where I have put Avatar, and you can answer these questions just as well as the other people. I'll shut up for a second to let you pause it, and then we will continue on. How to do cultural studies. You do that by asking questions. These are the questions that I've actually been asking you up to this point. What kinds of behaviors, what modes of practice does this work seem to enforce? What might readers at a particular time and place find compelling? Are there differences between my values and the values implicit in the work I am reading? Upon what social understanding does the work depend? Whose freedom of thought or movement might be constrained implicitly or explicitly by this work? Whose freedom might be encouraged or expanded? That's the one question on here that doesn't come from Greenblatt. And I was looking at it and thinking, yeah, you can constrain, but you can also encourage or expand, and so I've added that question there. What are the larger social structures with which these particular acts of praise or blame might be connected? That's really all cultural studies is. It's just asking questions like these about any particular text that you might encounter. They're not the only questions I'm going to ask, but they're a good starting place. So take a moment to jot those down, and any questions you might have about those questions, what they're getting at, and we can discuss those when we meet together again as a class. And that's it for our introduction to cultural studies. It's a complex field. It's a very rewarding one. You can work with it really your entire life and never get to the end of the thing because it's constantly growing and expanding. It's a really useful tool for studying literature. It gives you a way into the text other than, well, here's what I think it means, or I don't know what it means. There are always things you can talk about with cultural studies. I hope this has been useful. Look for more screencasts on different fields of literary criticism and theory in the upcoming weeks and months. And until then, take care, and I hope to see you soon.